Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be comparing and ranking the top F# web frameworks for backend. So why are we making this video? Well, for F# being such a small community, it actually has a lot of choices for different libraries and paths you can take to build your backend web server. And because it's so small, it really doesn't have many docs to help you choose. And then if we factor into account the near free interop with C#, we actually have like a ton of choices via .NET and still very few docs to kind of help you choose between them. So my solution for this is to just rank the top frameworks, specifically for web backends, and hopefully that'll help you get started. So to do this, first I'm going to start off with the methodology of these comparisons, then we'll go into the actual comparison results, and then we will end up with the rankings of the top web frameworks for you to use. So let's start off with methodology. Okay, as already said, there's actually quite a lot of choices in the .NET universe and therefore accessible via F#. So I wanted to make a few requirements to kind of cut down on the pool and make sure that we are picking frameworks that are actually good to recommend to you. So the first requirement is to be functional first. F# is a functional first language, and so in my opinion, if you're not using a functional first framework, you're kind of missing out on a lot of the reason we're using F# in the first place. If you don't want to use functional or you only want to use pseudo-functional, you can probably just use C# and find a better, well-used framework. So if you're using F#, we should probably stick with functional first. The second requirement is I'm only looking at backend frameworks, and specifically backend frameworks that have benchmarks for this comparison. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm personally most experienced with backend, and I would really only recommend F# for backend right now. And then I also wanted to have some data to play with, so I am making sure that we have benchmarks for all of these, but any framework that's been around for a while probably has a benchmark, so that doesn't really cut down that many. The next requirement is that I'm making sure that all these frameworks are, quote unquote, officially endorsed by fsharp.org. That's the F# Software Foundation. Doesn't really mean anything if they are like officially endorsed on the website. Not really, but it does mean that they've been around a little bit while and at least had someone who recommended it to them. So just another kind of layer of trust here. And then the last one is active development. I really don't want to recommend a framework that you start using and then it just doesn't have support at all. So I'm only looking at ones that are currently active. Now, all of these have the asterisk of they are in the F# community. F# community is small, and so many of the things and what they mean here, whether it's being endorsed or being actively developed, will mean something different than if it were in a more popular mainstream language. But hopefully these requirements get us down to a pool that's actually recommendable. Okay, so after filtering all the choices with these requirements, we come out with 5 different candidates. The first is Falco, the second Giraffe, the third Saturn, the fourth Suave, and then finally Web Sharper. I'm not going to go into what all of these are, though I've talked about many of them in previous videos. So if you want to know more about that, we won't cover it in this video, but you can just look it up on GitHub or look at their docs, and that should be plenty. I did want to touch on some notable omissions from this list and just kind of why they were omitted. The first is the front-end frameworks, so these are Fable and Bolero. You probably can build a full stack with them, but because they're not specifically focused on backend or known for doing that, I omitted them. And then some backend frameworks that probably are good, but we're just not going to focus on, are one ASP.NET Core, because it's just not functional, and if we actually look at these frameworks, a lot of them are just built on it. So you get that basically, but we want the functional wrapper. And then the second is Service Stack, which I've never used personally, but it looks pretty good and full-fledged, but it just doesn't seem like it's functional first, so we're omitting that one as well. Okay, now on to how we're doing these comparisons. So I'm basically looking at 2 different kinds of metrics when I'm doing these comparisons. The first is its usage. The reason being that usage is basically a proxy for basically how much support you'll get. If there's no usage of a framework, you'll probably get 0 support. If there's some usage, you'll probably get some support. We're using 2 different measurements to kind of proxy this. The first is GitHub stars, which is typically more useful for understanding the interest of a library or a technology. And it can correlate with usage, but when we think about this, it's possible for a lot of people to start something that's interesting but not actually use it in their projects. So to cover this, we're also going to be looking at the number of downloads that a given package gets via Nuget, which is .NET's default package manager. And this is good because it actually shows us like what libraries are being installed and thus gives us some sort of proxy for actual usage in projects. But the other problem about this is that it kind of can get skewed based on different deployments. Like if there's one large company using one of these libraries, that could very easily skew the downloads to be really high, even though it's just one company using it. So that's one area that we'll be looking at. The next one is going to be around performance, which will just be requests per second on benchmarks. This could have, again, been a comparison where I kind of go into each framework in detail, but that would take a really long time. It's kind of how I was going for this video. And so I'm trying to go more a little bit objective and just kind of use some measurements that we have available to us. Now, talking about measurements, the performance that we're going to be using is all coming from the Web Frameworks benchmark, which here's a screenshot here, and here's a link at the bottom. All benchmarks have asterisks, so we can't totally trust this thing. So it has its own drawbacks, just like the usage metrics we have. But this one's a pretty good one, and I've used it in a lot of my previous F# benchmark investigations, like this one, which is also linked below. Okay, that's how this is all set up. So hopefully you understand kind of what we're going to get into next, and that is the actual comparison results. So the first comparison we have here is performance. And again, this is in terms of requests per second from that web benchmark. And we see at the top our Falco and Giraffe at about the same, at 120 and 119,000 respectively. As always, these numbers are probably not what you're going to get if you run your own benchmark, but they're just kind of used for relative use. In third is Saturn, which makes sense. Saturn is actually a web framework that's built on top of Giraffe, and because it's built on top of it, it makes sense that it's 10-20% slower. And then finally we have Web Sharper at 85K, and then Suave way behind at 43K. Now this Suave result was weird to me, and I always look at results where these outliers are like super bad, especially when I know Suave is like kind of well used, as weird, and might be because of the benchmark. This happened in this previous investigation linked here for Giraffe, where Giraffe was like a super outlier and being bad, but when we looked at kind of the benchmark itself, we realized that there's a pretty easy fix to improve its results. So I thought that was the case with Suave because it was performing so poorly. But actually, when I looked at a few different benchmarks and cross-checked them, Suave just kind of performs poorly across all of them. So there might be something with the benchmarks, but it's at least consistent across multiple benchmarks. So maybe it's just slow. This is a screenshot from Tech Empower if you're not recognizing it. Okay, so we have our performance, and then now let's look at the usage so we can kind of like cross-check these stats. So if you look at the GitHub stars, Giraffe and Suave are by far the most used or most starred. Most people are interested in it, I suppose. And then the final three, Saturn, Web Sharper, and Falco, are all in the hundreds. So hundreds actually isn't that bad for F#. F# is a small community compared to like, a Python, which has like tens of thousands, millions of developers. But it's definitely not as good as Giraffe and Suave in this case. And the cool thing is, now that we have both a usage and a performance metric here, we can kind of start graphing it. And we kind of get to see a view of the landscape a little bit better. Here on the right, we have Giraffe, which is just outperforming most of these in both performance and GitHub stars. Suave, which is, a lot of stars, but just really not performing well at all. And then finally, we have this cluster over here that's like used a little bit, performs fine, which with Falco, Saturn, and Web Sharper. But let's look at it from this other angle of usage, which is the Nuget downloads per month. And when we look at this, we see Suave is now up front with 22K, Giraffe with 18K. Web Sharper is about a third of that and coming in third. And then Saturn's even less than that. And then Falco we see with less than 1,000 downloads per month. This does make sense, even though this seems like an outlier, because Falco is relatively new to the scene. And it's likely it just hasn't been pulled into many of these, or many of people's frameworks, especially not many companies' frameworks, I would guess, just because of how new it is. The other thing that is going against it is that Falco is kind of playing in the same space as Giraffe and Suave, going for these kind of like minimal performant APIs. And so while Suave obviously has this performance issue, it really needs to beat Giraffe, I think, to do anything more than Git hobbyists. So yes, it looks like an outlier, but based on my information, I don't think it actually is. Or I don't think it's like odd that it's there. So if we graph this, we see that Suave comes out in front with the number of downloads. And then we have Giraffe again, still placed really well top and to the right. And then we have, again, our cluster of Falco, Saturn, Web Sharper, which just aren't used that much, but have decent performance. Now, looking at these graphs, you might start asking things like, why is Suave used so much when it's like obviously performing the worst? And while it is possible that, the performance isn't as bad as it's shown here, it does seem to be consistent across them. So I do think it's actually performing poorly. And the reason for this, I think, though I don't know for sure, is that I believe Suave was one of the first web frameworks in the F# ecosystem. And so it had a lot of people gravitating to it because it was the first big one. And I believe that this was probably incorporated into several companies' stacks at some point. And I just think that it still has a lot of momentum because those people have adopted it and don't necessarily want to lose it yet. So that's what I think. I don't think it's because people are just totally ignoring the benchmark situation. I think at the time when it got this adoption, there just wasn't a better alternative out there. All these graphs, by the way, if you want them, are available on my blog post, which is linked at the bottom here. Okay, so that's all of our raw data and kind of some thoughts about them. Now let's go into the final rankings of kind of what we would recommend. So coming in first is Giraffe, which is the best F# backend web framework and the one that I would recommend to most people. It has both high usage in terms of our GitHub stars and Nuget downloads, and of course, anecdotally, just being in the F# ecosystem, a lot of people like it and use it as well. And it also just has really high performance. It comes in second with 119K, but that difference between first place is actually really, really low. So this is the best web framework and what I would recommend to most people for their backend web servers. And I don't just say that, I actually pick it for most of my projects as well. F# is my favorite general purpose language, and Giraffe is my pick for building web servers with it. If you're interested in see how I currently build most of my projects, you can check out Cloudseed, which is the boilerplate that I use for all of these. Coming in second is Suave, which is the most used. It has the second most GitHub stars and by far the most downloads, which kind of is a proxy for who's actually using that. But as we saw, its performance is really low. And so while this comes in second based on the kind of proxy metrics I chose for this comparison, I don't think I would actually recommend most people to use this. While performance is obviously not the most important thing in most apps, it's still important, and it just seems like there's either something wrong here or this just thing hasn't been kept up to date. So I would probably stay away until this gets looked at, particularly because we have so many other decent options for you to take. And another example of a good option for that is Saturn, which comes in third, which I think is a really good high-level framework if you want to use it. Again, Saturn is built on top of Giraffe. It's supposed to be a kind of simpler, less configuration, more opinionated framework to kind of just be easier to get started with. And it also allows you, if you want the performance, to drop down and use a lot of Giraffe's configuration as well, if that's what you need. So I think it has a good combination of usage and performance here. So I would definitely recommend this if you're looking for something to just get started with. Coming in fourth is Falco, which had the lowest usage of any of our candidates, but also had the highest performance. And so I mentioned this earlier, but the reason it has such low usage is mostly because it's just new. It's new to the scene, and the second part is that it's competing in a very similar space to Giraffe as a very minimal, very high-performing API, so it's going to have trouble gaining adoption if it needs to cannibalize directly from Giraffe, which is already well established in the scene. So we'll see where this goes. I have high hopes for Falco. I think it could get really good, but I just don't think it's there yet, and so for most things, especially if you're building a company or something, I don't know if I'd recommend this for the backend. And coming in last, we have Web Sharper, which is maybe surprising, but it's the full stack .NET for F# and C# framework. It does have medium usage and performance, so both of those are decent. But the reason I put it below Falco is because we're actually not sure how much of this is coming from F#. It's definitely possible that some of this is coming from C#, and I don't really have a great way to check that. So I think this one is okay. If you are trying to do some sort of full stack thing, then this one might be fine for you. But other than that, I think the more minimal side is probably better. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you disagree with any of this, if you have any questions, anything like that, and I'll try to get back to you. And if you are looking to get started with F# and Giraffe, the best backend web framework for F#, as I argued in this entire video, you can check out this video where I get you started with your own web API. And finally, this is where you can find me and follow along for new content. And I think that's it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.